Last month, we had our first session with Professor Danny Roderick and Professor Zoe Marks, and they focused on identifying the problems and challenges of limited diversity in the field of international development, and more so to set up a framework for how to think about the problem. You can find the recording of the session online. And today, in the second session in the series, we're going to pivot to talking about development, where our panelists will discuss different visions of what development often aims to accomplish. I know many of us on this Zoom call are familiar with the study and practice of different aspects of development. So, is there a single vision of the ultimate goal of development that's shared across different groups or even within one group? How do these goals matter? How should we respect that in the way we approach our work? And whether this is in research or you work in the government, nonprofit, or even the private sector. So obviously very excited to have these four amazing panelists, and I'm going to stop talking and ask each panelist to share a few minutes of their current thinking and work to dig into the question of how we can envision the concept of development in different ways. So I'd like to start with you, Lant, and then we'll hand it over to Mira, Megan, and Christy.
So I'm going to present one alternative view of development, which is that the way that in the development discourse, there's always been two kind of discourses about what development might mean that dealt with fundamentally different processes and had fundamentally different approaches. One was the discourse about national development that was about processes that were fundamentally beyond the individual and not individualizable. They were more about something we would call rule systems or collections of norms of practices, or as a last resort, and avoiding a piece of chalk from Nikita, who guarded it when she was my student, institutions. And there were four fundamental transformations in that: to a more productive economy, to a more responsive polity, sort of the transition from subject to citizen, to more capable organizations of governance and government, from sort of the privy purse to the IRS, kind of large, capable organizations. And fourthly, a transition to more equal treatment of students, from rather than having society strictly differentiated on conditions of birth and across kith and clan, broader social affiliations that led to more equal treatment, especially rule of law that treated all citizens equally, but even more deeply socially. So that's one set of processes. And then that was called development, but it was never, in my view, regarded as normative. That wasn't the objective, that was always instrumental. And the idea was that if we achieved progress in these four domains, that would lead to progress in the domains we cared about, which were measures of human well-being. And then that was always quite, I think, eclectic in terms of what the measure of human well-being that represented the human development goal. And fundamentally, any measure of human well-being is kind of either a money metric or a non-money metric, either kind of how much cash you have or do you have access to a toilet kind of thing, non-money metric. And so there was a variety of indicators. There was each of these indicators, since they were fundamentally about individuals, they were ontologically individualized. You had a distribution of them within any society. So you had a distribution of income, you had a distribution of access to education, you had a distribution of dignity, of whatever. And so a measure of human development was some mapping from that distribution in a country or a place to some measure based on that. And it was probably a aggregate. When we talked of human development broadly, it was some aggregate of a large number of indicators, because all of us agreed there were large numbers of things that we aspired to, and hence human development aspired to. So, so I just want to quickly go over three kind of basic facts that I think need to be part of any discussion about development and the objectives of development and the visions of development. And the first of those is that essentially all differences across country in money metric poverty are differences in the aggregate. If we take the central tendency of the distribution of income or consumption, that completely determines the poverty measures in a way that we'll see what I mean by completely. Second, if we construct an omnibus measure of well-being, and one that's constructed to replace economic indicators, that indicator is itself still almost perfectly correlated with national development. So the idea that there's a weak link between achieving national development and achieving these broader indicators of human development is just false. It's just not true. Every country that achieves high national development achieves high human development, and conversely, no country achieves high levels of human development with low levels of national development. So these two phenomena are highly correlated. And then the third thing is that if we look beyond just measures of human development to measures of the basics of human development, like access to primary and secondary school, measures of malnutrition and studying, measures of sort of excess mortality, those measures and kind of any of those measures, and I'm emphasizing any, any of these measures that you construct are going to be connected to GDP per capita, which is one element of national development, with a relationship that's strong, nonlinear, sufficient, and necessary, meaning no country has high level of GDP and doesn't achieve high level of basics. And it's very hard to achieve high levels of basics without reasonably high levels of GDP. And there's a very tight relationship between them. So let me just show the graphs, and this audience is used to graphs, so I hopefully won't have to explain them very much. But the left-hand side of this figure is the relationship between dollar a day, medium, and high level of poverty, the three back poverty lines that the World Bank typically uses. And basically, if you allow for a nonlinear functional form in median income, which is a measure of central tendency of the distribution from which they have calculated the poverty rate, the R squared is like 0.98, which means there's nothing left. Literally, if you say, what explains or what are the correlates of poverty across countries, the answer is the median of the distribution, full stop. Like once you have controlled for that or accounted for that, really nothing else matters except, again, at the margin of the 2% that's left unexplained. But all of the big differences between whether you have poverty of 50% or poverty of 5%, completely, totally income. And that's also true in changes. So the right-hand side graph shows the same graph, the same relationship between changes in the predicted amount of poverty you would have given your median and change in the poverty rate. And again, almost perfectly correlated even in episodes. So this isn't a levels versus changes thing, it holds true. It's slightly more technically complicated than that, as you probably know, but the technical complications are technical, not substantive. So second thing is this group called the Social Progress Index constructed an index of social progress that they constructed because they didn't want indicators of economics to be used in measuring development. So the purpose of this index is to get rid of economic measures. But then if you say, let's do a multivariate regression, regress that index of human well-being on national development, which I only have three elements of: GDP per capita, state capability, and democracy, measured in the standard ways. And to my point, for my point, it's important that I didn't data mine this. I just pulled down off the web whatever the standard indicators for these three things were. And the relationship, again, is super tight. The R squared between the correlation between the predicted kind of level based on national development and the actual is 0.95. And the right-hand side graph is a graph I invented, as you know, as I like to do. That's basically the envelope. This is the range of experiences in the co-determination of these two things across countries. And the main thing about the right-hand graph is the white space. There's nobody in the Northwest. Countries don't have high levels of human well-being without having high levels of national development, and the converse is true. No country achieves high levels of national development and doesn't achieve high levels of this social progress index. So second sort of point is, suppose you say, I don't want to measure poverty because it's monometric and it doesn't capture the food dimensions of human existence and et cetera, which I'm perfectly sympathetic with. The Social Progress Index has a whole bunch of indicators about the society, tolerance, freedom, rights, crime. If you add them all together, it's still the case that, up there in the Northeast is the cluster of countries we call developed, and they have high levels of national development, very high levels of human well-being, and clustered down at the bottom are countries with low level of national development and low level of human well-being. And yes, there's variation at any given level of national development. The variation at levels of national development is just completely swamped by the variation across levels of national development. The third thing, and this is kind of a fakey theorem because it involves words that are maybe a little less than precise, but my theorem is any general plausible index of basics of human well-being, and I'm writing a whole paper that shows that why I'm making the claim any, because I basically iterate over all the space of all possible plausible indices. It's going to have roughly the shape that I show in these graphs, which is the relationship is going to be super strong. So just GDP per capita, forget even the other dimensions of national development, which I'm not arguing aren't important. I'm just focusing on GDP per capita as one of them. Relationship is super strong. The relationship's hugely nonlinear. At low levels of income, the relationship is just unbelievably steep. And then it tapers off from kind of 35,000 per capita GDP, which is roughly Cyprus, on, they already have basics, so the elasticity with respect to basics is very low. So you could argue that once you're at that range for the achievement of basics, further GDP per capita doesn't matter, and you'd be right. But you don't want to confuse, you don't want to impose some nonlinear uniform relationship across. For the countries in the lower tail, it's just unbelievably steep. And again, I'm showing the envelope. The lower red line is sort of the worst it can be for any given level of GDP, and the upper line is the best it can be for any level of GDP. And again, the range of possibilities, there's just nobody in the Southeast except for one country, which is GNQ, which is Equatorial Guinea, which is the exception that proves the world. The exception that proves the rule. Yes, if you pump a bunch of oil and it goes to a few corrupt people, it's not going to benefit anybody in the country. Yeah, sure, no one would dispute that. But what's striking is how much of an outlier Equatorial Guinea is. Other resource-dependent places, again, have some of the characteristic that they're less reaching the basics at the same levels of GDP, but overall, it's a necessary and sufficient condition to achieve high levels of GDP to fully satisfy the needs of your citizens for basics. And I'm showing a multidimensional poverty index, which again is just one other index of basics, one of the hundreds and thousands that you could construct. So multidimensional poverty index has this, poverty has this taken alone. The basic human needs from the social progress index has this. And again, I've constructed my own favorite index, but the point is any index you build, if you start from a collection of basics that everybody would agree with, that is health, nutrition, education, water and sanitation, you construct an index of whether countries, populations are getting those, it's going to have this relationship with GDP per capita. So now, that said, this doesn't mean the visions of national development weren't wrong about many things. It's just we weren't wrong about that one. About the fact that if you achieve high levels of national development, you will in fact achieve high levels of human well-being. I don't think there's any factual question about that being correct. And again, there's still ranges of variation within any level of national development or any level, so you can do better or worse. But to really get to the high levels, countries just don't do it without also achieving high levels of a productive economy. That said, I think what certainly the literature and the thinking and the practice can be faulted on is within each of these four things, I've expressed the national development transformation in a very broad way. So somebody's rule, productive economy. One can take super narrow measures of that, like standard measures of GDP per capita, and miss out things that are in fact important and relevant about the productive economy. How broadly productive it is would be reflected more in an inequality weighted income measure than pure GDP per capita. And so getting what truly represents our notion of what we mean by the capability of the government to implement is important. And often we've taken narrow measures that were too narrow and too constricting and too superimposing ideology when we think we're being neutral. And then the other thing is we've often had wrong causal models about how to promote this. We've often been overconfident in there being a simple linear or simple way of achieving progress in these dimensions. So I think there's enormous range for debate and about not necessarily about how one would achieve development and what we really mean by these components of national development. And more particularly, there'll be debates about how much we can make progress in human development, even without national development, and what are the causal mechanisms and our underlying theories about how these are going to come about. But I think everybody's sympathetic to. There are clearly lots of countries that continue to have low levels of national development. So whatever our as the world or there as a society dynamic processes have been, they haven't led them out of low development yet. So we probably should be thinking maybe we or they or someone or somehow is wrong with how we or they are trying to escape. So let me stop there.
So thank you so much for inviting me. Appreciate that very much. And thank you, Lan, for our very interesting presentation. And I'm going to be talking actually through a very micro lens. And I've just got one slide here. Some of these pictures are from my own field research. And some bits are taken from a book monograph, that is my monograph that just come out. So I'll try and share all this within 10 minutes. So the epistemic foundations of my work are in the conceptions of development as a process. So it's a process that should enable what individuals, communities, and society aspires for. It is, you can see, it's quite subjective. It's quite normative, and I look at it. So also this is in terms grounded in the opportunities. So when we are talking of what individuals, communities aspire, it's about the process enabling the achievement of opportunities they value. And I'm going to try and actually give examples of how using this framework has produced the outcomes that are of one genre, and how using another approach has produced a different set of outcomes in the state of Bihar. State of Bihar is one of the poorest in India. Some progress made, but it remains, the human development indicators remain comparable to, some of the indicators are comparable to a DRC in Africa, whereas the economic development in India is quite impressive. At least before the COVID, definitely. There's been some dent in the last 18 months. But before that, what was being published, the data that was coming out was definitely impressive. But this state, along with a couple of others, remain quite disadvantaged and backward in many, many indicators. Not just the per capita income, it is about literacy, female literacy in particular, female workforce participation. At times, it was about 5 years back, it was noted to be barely 25% in some of the districts in the state of Bihar. So using this approach, and some of you may have picked up, it is very much grounded within Amartya Sen's capability approach, where development is development proposes or is a process that should enable people achieving what they value in life. It is normative, as I say, because one community values something, the other values something, and that's where public reasoning, public debate comes into action. So I'm going to use these two examples. One is using a very top-down money metric measure through MGNREGA. This is a flagship program in India that was launched in 2006 at the national level. The conceptions had social structures, social enhancing tools, but during implementation, it was reduced to, or let me not use the word reduce, it was implemented as a rights-based approach, guaranteeing 100 days of paid work to an ultra-poor household. And there's a definition of the ultra-poor within the Indian context that is below the World Bank poverty line of $1.90 a day. So it did help, definitely during the COVID, and I'll start from COVID because there was, as we all know, that India's 90% of workforce that was engaged in the informal sector was rendered unemployed almost overnight. Most are migrant laborers, and they went back. There was nothing. So they've lost their jobs, they've lost their pace of dwelling, they've gone back with huge misery experienced on way. So MGNREGA kicked in, where it could be activated. It provided that paid work. So people weren't reduced to destitution overnight, or even though their livelihoods were lost. So within a month, they were able to find some form of, and this has to be unskilled work. In the initial, so this was during COVID. Initially, it helped people with workforce participation. There was work for women in the villages. There was work for men in the villages. That is the initial. And in the 10 years or so, it is supposed to have helped 50 million households. Impressive. But at the end of that 10, a stock take shows that because it's temporary, it's a temporary paid for work. There is no skill enhancement. There is no social structure expansion of people that are engaged with. So whereas it improved the malnutrition in the family, it improved destitution, it prevented destitution, but that's where it stayed. And so you had, especially in the state of Bihar, before the pandemic, the people didn't claim. The engagement with the program was less than 60%. In places, it was 42%, which means just 42% of those who could engage with the scheme engaged. And there are a number of reasons. One of them being they didn't know it existed. They didn't know how to fill out the form. There are these social impediments that were not thought through in framing the program. It was that you fill out the form, you do this, you do this, you do this, that happens. And there were leakages in the system. There are some very good critiques of the program that outline leakages in the system because the political clout then claims for their own people. And they're very poor because of their inabilities, their lack of skills, are not even able to access that. So it helped, but it remained the human capabilities, the human well-being dimensions remained static. Now, there's another program that was launched in 2007 and 9. This is state-supported large women's self-help group network, Jivika. Currently, it has a membership of 1 million women. And I have studied this since 2009, every 2 years, gone back and studied 6 villages in different parts where this program was implemented. When I started, it was just in 6 districts. Currently, it's in all districts of the state, all 28 or 27 districts of the state. Now, because this is a very targeted program, targeting the empowerment of women and using that collective agency, because there's the individual agency, the women want to improve their situation, they want to address their marginalized situations. They are provided that the SHG platform provides that collective voice. Their livelihoods, different forms, some are in the form of farming, some are so improvement in productivity through using local methods, training, capacity building, nutritional training they would get, And that has led to some of the good examples of income generation activity. So it isn't just farming, or it isn't just taking their produce to the local market. They've set up a network of kitchen. So Didi's Kitchen, it's called. The Hindi word for kitchen, it's Didi's Rasoi. And they are providing food to the local hospitals, to the local government offices. And this is all over the state. So it isn't just a one-off. So there's always a criticism for such programs that they're scaling up, they becomes all pear-shaped. And this is an example where scaling up is working. And I'm not saying this has been perfect. There have been leakages in the system. There have been scaling up has diluted many of the advantages. There's just those 6 women from 6 districts were benefiting. But you can see that these women are now able to, this is a sustainable expansion of their social capabilities. So they are accessing opportunities, which is what the process of development should be doing. Beyond improving, enhancing income only. So they have the skills that that enables them to engage a multiple range of opportunities that they value. Some women have engaged with the Didi's Rasoi. Some have engaged with improving their farming structure, or in dairying, etc., improvement in the child upbringing, school nutrition, etc. So this is an example where I gave this example to demonstrate that a macro level top-down program helps, but it stagnates, it is limited, it is restrictive in what it can do with the human capabilities, the opportunities. And here I use the word capability as opportunity, that the real opportunities communities can access. And the Jivika example, it's not a micro example, this is a membership of 1 million women. They are expanding their capabilities in quite a different way. I think I've run out of time and I've got my 10 minutes, but do look at these slides. The last one on the right says proportion of women in COP26 leadership. It shows that in current day to date, in 2021, there were only 4 out of 17 leadership roles in COP26 in Glasgow. So that's something to think about, what top-down approaches would do and what empowerment from grassroots can do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mira. I'm so excited to talk about the contrasting views we've already heard. I'm going to hold that and ask Megan to please go next.
Thank you, Nikita. Hello, everybody. My name is Megan Noka-Hill. I am the program director of the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development at the Kennedy School. Normally, I would be joining you from Cambridge, Massachusetts, but today I'm joining you from my indigenous homelands of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, which, if you know U.S. geography, it's just west of Lake Michigan. So excuse me. So thank you for including me in this really important conversation, and I'm honored to sort of virtually sit side by my fellow panelists. So the Harvard Project is a research think tank that was founded in 1987. Our name is a little bit of a misnomer. We do work on economic development, but really what we do is we focus on governance and indigenous nation building as the underpinnings of successful development. And I mean development sort of widely: economic development, social development, cultural development. And I'd like to sort of begin with a little bit of context setting, because if your education was anything like mine, you probably didn't get much in the way of Native civics. And I think it's really hard to have a conversation about goals of development in what we call Indian country without having a little bit of a foundation. So I'll just take a minute to share some basic information with you. There are 574 federally recognized tribal nations in the United States. They constitute about 1.5 to 2% of the US population. We are not a racial group. We're actually political entities with our citizenship in tribal nations, with a unique relationship to the federal government that has its origins in the US Constitution and treaties. Tribes are incredibly diverse, from their size and geography, from tribal nations who their homelands are a few acres, to the Navajo Nation, which is about the size of West Virginia, to population from 100 citizens to over 500,000 citizens. We're in rural areas, we're in urban areas, our histories are different, our cultures are different, our governmental forms are different. So some of our governmental forms mirror the United States, some are parliamentary systems, some are theocracies. And if you look at US Census data, you're going to find that the social and economic conditions also vary, where tribal nations occupy both the richest tracts of land in the US and also the poorest. And so there's a really sort of wide variety of that. And what's important to understand is that in the US since the 1970s, we've been in what we call an era of self-determination, where tribal nations have the same powers and responsibilities of any state or local government to meet the needs of their citizens. So for example, they're responsible for paving roads, for managing health departments, to running schools and curriculum development, to trash collection. So anything and everything you can think of that a state and local government does, tribal governments do too. But unlike states and local governments, tribes don't have traditional tax bases to pay for governmental functions. And so instead, they depend overwhelmingly on business enterprises. And just a quick lens into sort of what's been happening on the ground in the last year, 18 months with the pandemic, is when the pandemic hit, everything shut down, right? And there was this abrupt shutdown of tribal enterprises, casinos, an array of businesses, and the result was this immediate and shocking economic impact where revenues went to zero. And so it's really been devastating both to tribal economies, but also to tribal governments because they're so closely tied. The other thing to note is that tribal nations in the US are significant economic engines in rural America. And there's significant spillover impacts regionally. And just to give a little scope to that, right before the pandemic, tribes are contributing aggregately $127 billion of GDP to the US economy. That constitutes 1.1 million jobs. And what's really interesting is of that 1.1 million jobs, 915,000 jobs, so 75 to 80% of those jobs were held by non-natives. So you see this really significant regional spillover beyond tribal borders and boundaries to our non-native neighbors. And so that's just a little lens into the pandemic. I think, you know, all nations, sort of the pandemic revealed the cracks, and that's also true of Indian country. And so now really the development focus is infrastructure and building roads, water systems, broadband. And so when we talk about goals of development in Indian country, it's really multifold, but it's about building and rebuilding sustainable communities and nations, which actually results in this rising tide where when tribal nations do well, everyone does well. The entire region is lifted up. And so what we find through our research is that tribes that find development success, and again, development broadly, economic, social, cultural, and beyond, they've built an environment where they have the governing foundation to step into their sovereignty, step into their self-determination, sort of on their own terms and on their own priorities, backed up by institutions. So I'm talking about codes to justice systems that are in alignment with cultural norms. And by culture, I really mean, how does power work? How does decision-making work? And is that aligned with that tribal nation in particular? And then all that sort of coalescing with leadership that sort of sets the tone and the vision and doesn't get sort of mired in the little politics that aren't helpful, and really changes the conversation. So I think I might stop there, and maybe in the question and answers I can tease out some more specific examples from tribes that we see through our Honoring Nations program. So thank you.
Thank you, Megan. And I'm just going to hand the floor to Christy.
Great. Thanks so much. Thank you, Nikita, for moderating this. Thanks to everyone for the invitation and for being here. I'm going to preface my comments by saying that I'm a historian and a historical sociologist. So my job is to uncover and explain historical patterns in order to understand how the world came to look as it does. So therefore, my interest in kind of alternative visions of development, as we're talking about here on this panel, looks to history for what it can tell us about what development was and is, and that should help us understand what it could be. To do that, I'm going to swing, we're really doing diversity of development here. I'm going to swing wildly in the other direction from what my co-panelists have talked about and go from the kind of micro local up to the macro global. That's, you know, as a sociologist, this kind of macro global look is what I'm going to focus in on today. So today I want to make the case to you briefly, based on the research that went into my first book, which Nikita mentioned, Revolution and Development, Mexico and the Governance of the Global Economy, that how we understand the history of the development project affects what we think it can be. About a decade ago, the eminent Malawian economist Thandika Mkandawire published an essay where he argued against conventional understandings of what we might call the origins of development, right? He calls the conventional understanding the Truman version of development, and that's a familiar story to us. It's one that we all know, right? One where the birth of development happens at the end of the Second World War, when the management of the decline of European empires and the rising power of the United States combines under the sign of this new project, a new way of ordering the world that's called development, right? Those of us who teach courses, this is kind of where we start this project, right? This is very much the kind of conventional story that starts all of our textbooks and starts how we tell this story. Most accounts will point to Truman's 1949 inaugural speech, where he announces the Point 4 program of technical assistance as the kind of date of the birth of this new system, a US-led, mostly top-down project that diffused, as one important history has it, right, from Western origins to global faith. So Mkandawire, he acknowledges this Truman version of development, but then he calls our attention to a second origin story, which he calls the Bandung version. This is what he calls the other source of developmentalism as an emancipatory project. So Mkandawire argues about development. He says, quote, catching up has been driven by the emancipatory aspirations of developing countries themselves and their understanding of the Western advantage that has sustained its dominance. I think this two-part formulation and how Mkandawire thinks about this is really important. Development then is the product not only of the national aspirations of third world leaders and thinkers, but of their recognition of their place in the international system as well. And that's why he emphasizes Bandung here, right? As an internationalist moment when the developing countries organize a set of collective demands and aspirations. And so he therefore wants us to highlight this alternative genealogy of the development project, asking how we could tell a story about development that starts not in Washington, right, but in the global South itself, right? It's this internationalist tradition that I want to highlight as a key alternative vision, as our panel has it today, right? Over here in development sociology, we also tend to think of development in these methodologically nationalist terms, right? Trying to understand the particular domestic configurations of state and market, these particular local programs that would contribute to successful development strategies. But if we turn back the historical story, we can see that as important as getting the domestic prices or institutions right has been organizing to change the international rules, regulations, and institutions within which these economies are embedded. So my book traces this kind of internationalist organizing, but in fact makes the case that in order to fully trace this alternative genealogy, we need to start not at Bandung in 1955, but back decades earlier in the interwar period, when countries in Latin America, in fact, began to organize collectively for new institutions and rules intended to promote their economic development. So my work details this organizing and its effect on how the development apparatus that emerged at mid-century was shaped. Though the conventional Truman story, as Mkandawire calls it, right, often folds this whole thing into a story of US-led consensus, the history that I uncover in my book is in fact highly contentious right? It involves a lot of struggle. And that's because this internationalist organizing was frequently organizing for new rules and regulations, not merely for the developing world, but in fact to constrain the rich countries and their prerogatives as well. So just a few examples. There were key struggles over, for example, the rules and regulations for international finance following the Great Depression. That makes sense, right? The international financial system collapses. The poorer countries, in fact, come to this important meeting. Obviously, first the World Economic Conference in 1931. When that attempt at cooperation collapses, the countries of Latin America and the United States get together in 1933 at the meeting of the annual meeting of the regular meeting of the Pan American Union. This happens in Montevideo, Uruguay, and there, the Mexican foreign minister, whose name is Jose Manuel Puig Casaranc, he leads this effort to rewrite the rules for international debt and credit. And he argues there for what he calls a new legal and philosophic conception of credit that will recognize the kind of reciprocal relationship that exists between debtor and creditor. So he puts this on the table in this international forum in 1933. Over the ensuing years, there's actual negotiation over how to instantiate this into an institution. This is followed by successful negotiation over the next few years between the Latin Americans and US officials to create this brand new institution, the Inter-American Bank. This would have been the world's first multilateral development bank. And it's really key here that the demand for this institution comes not from the global north, not from Washington, but from the Latin Americans themselves. It was imagined as a comprehensive development institution, one that would help manage currency and balance of payments problems, but also channel surplus capital of the global north to productive developmental use in the global south. This is negotiated by important US officials like the Treasury's Harry Dexter White. And they actually create a kind of charter and bylaws for this institution, but it then gets stymied in Congress when it has to be ratified, and it never comes into being. Nevertheless, the internationalism being pushed from below by these Latin Americans continues during the subsequent negotiations around what my colleague Eric Helleiner has called the development mandate of the Bretton Woods institutions. There at Bretton Woods in 1944, Latin Americans and their allies in places like India and elsewhere ensured that development would be a key aspect of the purview of, for example, the World Bank. They also at that meeting organized against unilateral decision-making power of the United States and for representation of the debtor countries in the new institutions that will emerge, the IMF and World Bank. But they quickly come to realize that the World Bank and the IMF are not enough. It's not enough for the international development project that's being imagined from the global south to have these two institutions. And so the Latin Americans who I trace in my book then turn their sights on a framework called the Economic Charter for the Americas. And this gets negotiated in 1945 at this meeting in Chapultepec in Mexico City. To have real intended protections for the developing world, for infant industries, trade protections. The document that actually emerges from that meeting, while there's a kind of free market vision that comes from the United States, the document that emerges was intended to put what the Mexican president called limits of justice on the economic activity of the rich countries in order to foster a kind of globally redistributive project. This then gets followed by more than 2 years of very contentious negotiating by a nascent third world coalition around the proposal for the International Trade Organization, right? This happens in 1946, 1947, 1948. And there in the negotiations over the ITO, which was to be the kind of third leg of the post-war development apparatus, the Latin Americans and their allies actually won so many concessions from US negotiators that the British negotiators there professed to being astonished at how much the United States had actually bent to these demands from the global south. Again, of course, we know that this effort was defeated, as the Inter-American Bank had been, by the interests of organized capital in the global north, particularly things like the National Association of Manufacturers, the National Foreign Trade Council, these kinds of powerful business interests in the United States managed to lobby against this and prevent the ITO from being ratified in Congress once again. So with this history, I argue then the vision of US-led development that took shape when President Harry Truman announces his Point 4 program of technical assistance in 1949 was not, in fact, a beginning or an invention, but rather a culmination of more than 2 decades of contention and organizing between these officials in the United States, Europe, Latin America, and the rest of what will become in the coming period, the Third World. So by extending this alternative vision suggested by Makandawiri then back into the period before the Truman version of the story, my work argues that this longer history of developmentalist internationalism actually allows us to understand that in fact development was a demand of the Latin American and other poorer countries as early as the 1920s and was the object of sustained international organizing among them during the 1930s, 1940s, and then of course into the post-war period. A demand that was at first actually strongly resisted and then haltingly co-opted by the United States in the 1940s and 1950s. What Makandawiri calls the Bandung version of development might actually more accurately be called the Montevideo version, right? Tracing its longer Latin American roots. I think that tracing this history allows us to understand the ways that developmentalism has always, from the beginning, also been internationalist and has always sought not only the transformation of nationally bounded domestic economies, but has frequently also sought the transformation of the broader global economic system into which those economies are inserted, right? So recognizing the real constraints of the global economy and trying to organize the global South collectively to overcome them has also been this key part of development, and one that I think continues right through the 20th century, obviously with the creation of UNCTAD and the G77 and the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States, the right to development, all of these kinds of UN frameworks. I think there's even an argument to be made that things like the Sustainable Development Goals themselves, right, are the result precisely of this kind of internationalist organizing on the part of the developing world. So thus, I think a key way to actually think differently about what development has been and could be is coming through this kind of understanding of developmentalist internationalism, not just the kind of local or national level, but thinking about how development has tried to address the international level as well. This means understanding over a much longer period what the demands from below have been over time and what this internationalist organizing has actually achieved. But perhaps even more importantly, it means understanding how the goals of this internationalist organizing have been foreclosed. So that is where, how, and why they were actually defeated historically. We get a story then, not about the failure of convergence or catching up, but one that is about the struggle over the very terms on which such catching up could even happen. So thinking about development in this way, I think, gives us a new genealogy of developmentalism as internationalism. And this is a still ongoing struggle about the rules and institutions that govern the global economy. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Christy, and thank you again to all the panelists. I think if you're comfortable, it would be great to get everyone back on video. I'm about kind of what you heard from some of the other panelists that might have challenged your view or you'd like to comment on. And I see the audience has started sending in questions. Please continue to do that. But I selfishly wanted to start by actually asking a question back to Christy, because we talked a lot about the necessary dynamism of international institutions in order to change their frameworks over time to respond to what's actually happening in the world. I think in your forthcoming book, you say something like, street politics reverberates to the International Hall of Economics and Politics. What are the characteristics of successful instances of this? And are there times when it might actually hamper development objectives? How do you know how to balance the internationalism versus the kind of community-driven social movements?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So part of my interest in the new book that I'm working on now, which is about how actors within international financial institutions kind of understand and react to global social protest, derives from the work that I did in this first book. And there's this kind of interesting moment in that struggle over the International Trade Organization where you have Mexican industrialists and labor unions and political parties getting together in 1947 to protest this new framework that is the International Trade Organization, the ITO. We tend to think of protest against IFIs as something that happens at the turn of this century, right? I've got it all the way back at the very beginning of the creation of these institutions. And so, you know, the thing that I think is really interesting here is that we necessarily have to understand the terms in which there is kind of political and social struggle over what national development will mean and over how countries are inserted into these broader global economic structures. So that to me is my interest. Of course, the kind of particular interest of these Mexican industrialists who want to see their infant industries protected, right? They want to kind of keep themselves away from global competition. That is not to say that that was necessarily the kind of quote unquote right strategy for a broader Mexican development, right? It's the right strategy for these nationalist industrialists who want to protect their own interests, right? So I think in order to understand it, we have to sort of trace those, this is what a historical sociologist would say, right? We have to trace those kind of historical social forces in how they have struggled against one another over time, and how that domestic social struggle then informs what these countries do when they show up in these international fora.
I think from Christie's end of the comment, we looked at how often within a society you also have a lot of competing power dynamics and what group thinks about development differently, but then she also zooms out to talk about internationalism and then obviously the North versus South question. And that made me think of your nonlinear relationship curve.
Yeah.
And often, at least in the MPID program, we talk about the fact that development is done by the people on the flat part of the curve for the people on the steep part of the curve. How do we leverage that awareness to then think about how do you fix it and do development differently when you're thinking about different parts of the curve?
Yeah, I do think, and I have written a piece called "Can Rich Countries Support Development?" I do think it's a very large concern that, as in some sense, the gap in GDP per capita and the development process and prospects of individual countries has grown wider. Like, people will often confuse what I call preferences and priorities. People in the rich countries today, Europe, France, the UK, the US, Japan, have, given the nature of their past success and their current material and other circumstances, radically different sets of priorities than people at much lower levels of GDP, not because they have different preferences over what they would like, but because their material circumstances are such that they're meeting lots of those basic needs already. And so they tend to see other agenda items as having higher priority in their own lives. And the danger is that they, look in a mirror and think they're looking through a window and think, well, since this is important to me and it isn't on the agenda in India, therefore there is some problem in the articulation of the national agenda in India that I as a development person need to fix, where it could just be, look, if when the US was as poor as India is today, which was roughly the Civil War, the US had radically different sets of priorities about what they were doing. And I think maintaining a development discourse in which one can recognize that, the ability of the development organizations based in the West and North to maintain the empathetic connection with the priorities of the South, I think, is a very, very big and important issue. Because I think now many leaders in the South just no longer feel the development institutions are truly responsive to their own articulated goals and purposes.
Thanks. And I think the priorities versus preferences matters a lot. And I then wanted to actually pivot to Megan, because I think self-determination and sovereignty is more a priority, not just a nice to have or a preference. And I think you can speak quite a bit to how Native American tribes are pursuing self-determination. And sometimes that sovereignty co-evolves with economic outcomes positively, and sometimes it doesn't. So I'm interested in if you can help us think about how these dynamics play out, and how do you then systematize how to think about nation building and development how much do they co-involve and how much do they just kind of balance each other out?
So in the US, the only policy that has ever worked for tribes to sort of get out of poverty is self-determination, self-governance, and sort of stepping into your own sovereignty. And so when, you know, so just to give a little example, we work with a tribe in Montana, large land base, lots of marketable resources from coal to oil to minerals to timber, high access to markets, actually spectacularly high educational rates, but really struggling with high employment, sometimes upwards of 80%, high incidence of social problems, gangs, substance abuse, failed nation-owned enterprises, a history of mob rule, political turmoil, just sort of these continuing cycles of poverty and difficulty achieving their own nation's goals. It's not because the people are bad, it's because the structures are bad. And what is happening is in 1934, the US government imposed these cookie cutter constitutions on tribal governments throughout the United States, and they didn't fit. We talked about culture a little bit before. They didn't fit the tribal nation's culture. They centralized power in many cases, does not correlate to that tribal nation. This particular nation traditionally had decentralized power. So they went through a process of constitutional reform so that their structures reflected that decentralization, and things are turning around. Unemployment went down, huge increases of citizen entrepreneurship, and you start to see that dial turning. 574 different tribal nations. It's going to look different in every place, but the key is that self-determination. It is having the local governance power to determine what your priorities are and how you're going to achieve those in a way that matches your contemporary culture. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And it can be in a number of different ways. You know, we also work with a tribe in Arizona who their goal was to take care of their elders who were going into elder care hundreds and hundreds of miles away because they didn't have the facilities. They then decided, this is one of our nation's priorities. We're going to create what is now a 5-star elder care facility on tribal homelands. So our elders who don't speak English largely don't have to go away. They are now creating high-level jobs. They're creating, you know, systems for food sovereignty. You know, so there's all these sort of intermixing pieces. So it doesn't have to look sort of like traditional economic development. It can come at it in a different way, but it builds the foundation of the nation. And one of our elders says, you know, what all this is about is putting a new memory in the minds of our children, that things can be different.
Yeah. And I think, you know, we set the stage with Lant kind of talking about why we don't need to disparage GDP, but then we're hearing so many examples of local action. And I think, Mira, you also talk about the need for a convergence of goals, which mirrors what Megan was saying, what Christy was saying about how unless you have the local actors kind of playing a role in defining what the goal is, and whatever the goal is what the development of the group will be. So how do we think about marrying a grassroots approach with a more standardized framework that doesn't have to toss away kind of the empirical things that we saw early on? And Lant, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, if I can just come in here, because I think Joe Cult, who has been part of the program that Megan is working with for a really long time, if I had to say what the best research in the world is about the importance of match between culture and institutions, it is his research, because in MPID-ish kind of wonky terms, there was this exogenous shock that the federal government superimposed a common, you know, strategy and approach across enormously heterogeneous peoples. And so I think this is a great example where the one, and he can show that, you know, I can talk about specific features of the culture, and when that culture was consistent with the strategy the US imposed, the tribes actually did okay. And when it wasn't consistent with it, it produced dysfunction, whereas an alternative approach would work. So I think this is maybe the best empirically documented example, because since, as we know, the world is complex and exogenous and involves, you know, according to its own dynamics, here's a case where a unifying dynamic superimposed on really massive underlying heterogeneity and produced, you know, clear evidence that it was the match that mattered. And I think it's really a powerful it's a powerful story about how, even though, and I love this phrase that I've just heard from Megan, stepping into your sovereignty, even though in some sense underlying we might have had similar objectives about the ways in which peoples were able to articulate and carry out their goals, the ways in which the specific instantiations of modalities and mechanisms that were going to make that happen had to be very different to accommodate the very different realities. So I'm just singing the praises of the program that Megan works for, which I think is a really interesting, and I think our development program at Harvard hasn't paid enough attention to what they do. They're a really interesting, in some sense, microcosm of the development process, or a development process embedded within this super powerful federal structure that has been able to mess with it for good or ill for 200 years or more. So
that's right. Thank you.
Thanks, both. Mira, do you want me to repeat the question? Would that be helpful? I think you're on mute.
Okay. So I've got a couple of comments here, and then I'll address that. I'll come to that question. So in my view, countries don't need to go back and define what they want to be, looking at examples from where other countries were, because this is a kind of a very colonial mindset. So India should define where it wants to be today in terms of whatever the GDP, its GDP is. And I'll give you an example from within India, one of the states, Kerala. Doesn't have the highest GDP within its 15 major states, 28 states and all. It doesn't. It's a mid GDP state, but its human development indicators in terms of gender equality, in terms of female participation, literacy, health indicators, education indicators for both male and female, they are comparable to that of a European country. So I think, and I know Kerala is many times termed as an outlier. It's not a representative of India. It is a part of India. It is an Indian state, and it's done that within the infrastructure of the country. And one of the questions there is on the environmental indicators and correlation with GDP. I think that's something that we must look at it now. You know, how and the definitions of human well-being must be revisited. What if you are a developed nation like the UK, but we've got very high levels of pollution in London? So how does that correlate? So I think it's time to really revisit or include other in how we measure human well-being, so that the graphs are, the graphs include those dimensions. This is absolutely the time. We are UK hosted COP26, so it'll only be very fair that I bring that point on, mainstream that point. So coming to your question, sorry, I had to make these sort of points because I thought Kerala is an example that you have to provide in terms of bucking the trend almost. And so within the approach that I am talking about, that I say grassroots, engaging the actors, it's not rejecting the economic focus at all. Economic focus is important, GDP is important, but what it's saying is that it's not the driver, as it was done in Kerala. So within those means, they achieved the social indicators that put them on a higher happiness index within India. So in terms of, definitely there needs to be complementarity between the two approaches. And I think there are different local models. Kerala is one where they've done that. Sri Lanka too has to a large extent done that. Sri Lanka is also not a very high GDP country, but the human development indicators are very impressive. So I would profess for complementarity in the two approaches within the capability approach, and says there are economic deprivations and there are deprivations of opportunity, or what we call capability deprivations or social poverties. So I think we need to work into integrating both. So that would be my response.
I think Lant would agree. He's nodding his head, and I'll actually reframe the question that came to you, Lant, about what Mira was saying is from my classmate and your student, Eric Nussbaumer. He says, have you looked at the correlation between an increase in GDP and ecological indicators like air quality, biodiversity, CO2 emissions, which obviously over time pose a greater risk for long-term economic and human development? How should we think about how to include such measures in our evolving understanding of development?
So in the source line of the figures I was showing, there is a paper called National Development Delivers and How, exclamation point, and how question mark. And part of the and how question mark is the differences across indicators in the relationship to national development, because there's two important differences across indicators like biodiversity, which are included in the set of everything Mira talks about is in fact included in the realm of the indicators that I'm examining. I know we have indoor air pollution, we have outdoor air pollution, we have all the environmental indicators are in the pool of indicators we start with to examine them. But then there's two important things. One, for many of these indicators, the state capability and democracy are more important than is GDP per capita. So not surprisingly, the things that are local public goods like outdoor air pollution, they tend to get internalized and addressed through political rather than market processes. So again, not surprisingly, when we look at the high correlation with national development, there is a correlation with national development and indicators of locally born, not global, but locally born environmental indicators. But it tends to be channeled more through a political channel. So again, nothing about what I'm saying means you should emphasize, I mean, the national development approach has all four transitions in it. So that's a great point. And I think this is a perfect example of how we would think about it. It's like, GDP is not going to solve all ills. I mean, one thing it's not going to do is if you operate at market prices, it's not going to internalize the negative consequences of pollution. But on the other hand, political processes can do that. So I think that's the first important thing. But then the second important thing is when you I do distinguish between basics and non-basics. And some of the environmental indicators like biodiversity indicators tend to only improve at a quite high level of the income curve. And again, I don't think this is, if in fact your problem is you don't have a clean place to go to the bathroom in the morning, kind of biodiversity is not going to be among your priorities, even if it's in your set of preferences just as strongly as it would be for environmentalists in Germany. So again, when you look at we look at how national development influences these things, you do have to distinguish what's going to be a priority at what stage of the process, and we don't want to retroject priorities based on our current priorities, our meaning people that are in rich countries now. So I do think those are two important channels, and I do explore them, of how do these environmental indicators, and one, there's going to be a big difference between super locally born brown issues like indoor and outdoor air pollution, which tend to look more like basics, the kind of locally born green issues like land degradation, and then the global issues. And we all admit that the global issues are not going to be taken care of with national processes.
And how much do you think this holds up at different levels, the central level and more subnational or regional levels? Just thinking of the example that Mira was giving about Kerala. I love Kerala. Their food is amazing, but I think that's a useful point.
But Kerala, can I push back on Kerala a little bit?
Of course.
Because Kerala, if we just think about GDP versus GNI, GDP is what's produced in the space. GNI is the income of the people affiliated with Kerala. And if we look at Kerala as an integrated Keralan economy between the space of Kerala and the Gulf, Kerala is a very rich economy. It's just the Keralans aren't highly productive in Kerala, so they go to the Gulf. And so a lot of the outlier status of Kerala doing really well relative to its GDP is that Keralans aren't productive in Kerala, they're productive in the Gulf, and then they remit income. So GNI, gross national income, is much higher in Kerala than its GDP. And so saying that Kerala is a low income place that does really, really well is a little misleading. It's not as low income as it appears from GDP because of the massive remittances. And so Kerala is in some ways this odd place where we do really well at investing in people, but we don't actually provide a productive environment for the work. So not surprisingly, many of them move abroad to work. They work productively because they did get a high quality education. So, I think the story of Kerala, particularly as it moves on, has gotten much more complex with, sooner or later, when you point to Kerala and say, oh, look how well they do on human development at their low level of, national development or GDP, sooner or later you have to flip it and say, well, wait a second, if they have all this wonderful human development, how come they can't turn it into higher levels of GDP? And the answer is they're living off to a very significant extent, not being politically forced to create a productive environment in their own territory because of the outlet of remittances.
Yeah, no, but I mean, sticking on the issue of kind of a decentralized example, this is a question also from my classmate, not that I'm biased, Gonzalo Huertas, who says to Megan Hill, following on your point about centralization, educational development is also a concept that might often be imposed from the outside. What can we learn about the experience of, example, native tribes in Australia, which are allowed by the state governments there to provide their children with their own traditional learning curricula, rather than being compelled to send their children to the centralized or mainstream schooling system?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have much the same experience that Aboriginal nations in Australia face in the US. And in terms of education, that's a huge issue where there's a program here in the United States called Head Start. It's supposed to give you a head start in your educational sort of journey. And we think of it as, where is it a head start to if you are sort of separating language, culture, anything that actually speaks to our identity as Native people? Where is that a head start to? Because it's not a head start to be leaders of our tribal nations. And so what you're seeing more and more tribes reclaiming their educational systems, curriculum, teachers. There's a tribal college movement now where there are actual tribal colleges on Indian land that are merging both traditional knowledge and wisdom and practices with sort of your mainstream math, sciences, English, that sort of thing. And so that there is context of who we are as Native people to the educational system. And when you find that, you actually see higher levels of educational attainment because there's context to that. And I saw that question in the chat. Whoever asked it, please send me an email. I'm happy to give you lots of specific examples of where that's happening with different tribes in the US.
Thank you. And I know we're coming close on time, and so I'll kind of ask one question to Christy and then ask a concluding question to all of you who are all teachers. But the question is, how can international agencies then better internalize local goals and local knowledge? Very simply.
That's an easy question to answer. I mean, I do think that there is, one of the things that has emerged I put out a book back in 2005 working with Deepak Nair and Ha-Joon Chang and Joe Stiglitz on precisely these questions, right? So we've been having this conversation for a long time. And, I think that many of the attempts to reform these institutions have come precisely from the sort of idea that there is a loss of legitimacy, there's a loss of kind of democratic accountability. And so there has been, once again, this kind of organizing from below for better democratic accountability, better representation, right? New structures for kind of redistributive mechanisms. And so we continue to see this sort of push. And I think, one of the things that's important about going back and reading the history is to understand the ways in which, somebody asked in the chat about whether the Truman version and the Bandung version are kind of opposing forces. And I think rather we should think of them as a relation, right? We should think of the ways in which these things have been related together, kind of sutured together in contest over time, because that allows us to see the kind of balance of power when there is a particular move to make a reform happen. What are the forces arrayed against it? Who defeats it? Who specifically defeats it, right? Can we look and say, oh, the National Foreign Trade Council, US manufacturers intervened in this particular moment to say this thing wouldn't happen, so that when we try to do that reform again, right, we understand what the potential forces arrayed against it might be, so that we can learn those lessons of history, right? So that we don't just keep repeating this attempt to kind of reform institutions over and over and over again in ways that does little but kind of rebuilds their legitimacy and doesn't actually achieve any of the goals that are being pushed from below.
Thanks, and I think that's a really good segue for my last question to all of you. I know that Lant and Mira, you're across the pond, but very much aligned in spirit. And since you all have very strong pedagogical approaches to teaching this in the classrooms, I think I'd like to start with you, Christy, because you integrate a lot of interdisciplinary approaches, being of a different epistemic background. So to all of you, how do we better equip development practitioners, many of whom are on the call, with the nuanced perspectives of history and overarching macro framework, community-driven ideas of self-determination? How do we do all of that while thinking about the modern-day challenges of improving lives of people everywhere?
I want to emphasize the instrumental importance of believing the lie and ignoring the history, though, in the sense that most successful institutions and organizations have a foundational myth that most of the stakeholders and participants in the institution and organization believe in and adopt that is just fundamentally historically false. And this is true, someone once said of a nation is a group of people who hate their neighbors and misunderstand their own history. That's their definition of a nation. And so I think having a shared vision is really important. And often a shared vision deliberately suppresses the heterogeneity and conflictual nature of the true origins in order to induce the commitment to the cause. And I think we need to balance those two things, because I think what Christy is saying is really important in times of change. In times of change, you rediscover the history, but in normal times, it's kind of good to kind of like not probe it too much. We're all kind of committed to this great thing and we're training to do it, and we share, emphasizing what we share is important in order to induce the cooperation. So I think as a pedagogical approach, I like to teach some balance of believe in the myth and understand that it's a myth. And it's a hard balance to maintain.
I guess my only response to that would be, I guess I increasingly question the extent to which we will ever be in anything resembling normal times again. And our kind of time frame for what is normal, our understanding of sort of, the kind of normative case of what development looks like and how we do this is based on a kind of very short period of history on which we have then extrapolated these kind of much broader lessons. And so I think, asking the kind of positionality question that Mira has asked us, sort of for whom is this normal? From which perspective is this normal? I think is an important underlying question. That's something that I try to get at in my teaching, maybe in a little bit of contrast there.
Yes, Christy, I agree that the focus on the positionality, who is it for? For a practitioner, I think, because I'm emphasizing on the micro, the grassroots, I think that those questions are very important, and how, for whom, and here currently we are intensely engaged in the debate on decoloniality and decolonizing the curriculum. So I think those are very important frameworks that I would instill into a practitioner. You cannot go in Uganda and suddenly reject Ubuntu and say, well, what voodoo science is that? You cannot do that. So I think respecting the culture, the context, at the same time, bringing together the methods with which you measure change is very important. So I am all in for supporting a constructionist approach, but it must be embedded in a very positivist, people enriching focus. So hard, very hard, but who says anything was easy?
You're making me want to go back to school, all of you. But Megan, please.
Echoing what everybody said, I think the fundamental lesson from Indian country: no cookie cutter approach, one size does not fit all. And you know, local control, really important.
No, I mean, thank you so much to all of you. I think I started this meeting by saying maybe is there a single vision of development with an ultimate goal that's shared? But I think I learned that there doesn't really need to be a single shared vision. Context matters. There are basic fundamentals that have lasted through time that help guide the way. But all of you, I think, are really inspiring for the work you do on the ground, and then the way you translate that to the practitioner community and to the students. I know a lot of people have hard time stops at right now, so I'm going to wrap up. But thank you again to all our audience members who joined. Sorry if we did not get to your question, but I think you know how to find the panelists with the power of the internet. The recording of this call will also be sent to everyone who registered. And really thanks again to everyone for joining. I'll stay on the call a few more minutes if anyone has questions, but especially thank you to all our panelists. Land, it was so nice to see you again. Mira, Megan, Christy, I hope to meet you all in person one day too.